So now we're recording. So be very careful what you say now. In the meantime, there's this, I guess the king comes up with this idea that he needs to get rid of Hamlet somehow. And so he takes the son of Polonius. What is his name again? Escapes me.
Laertes?
Laertes, exactly. He gets Laertes to challenge, well, Laertes is already upset at Hamlet and blames his father's death on Hamlet, so he wants to get his revenge. And so they propose a friendly, not actually friendly, but supposedly friendly and not dangerous competition in sword, sword play and so on. The king puts some poison on the sword, right? So that if it even touches Hamlet, Hamlet will die. Instead, Laertes gets cut by the same sword. When he realizes what has happened, he confesses to Hamlet. The king, just for good measure, has poisoned the chalice, right? He keeps trying to get Hamlet to take a drink, but Hamlet is not thirsty. So when Hamlet finds out, he forces the king to, well, the queen drinks it in the meantime, right? She starts to die. Everybody gets poisoned and dies, and then that's the end, right? And there's this nice sleeping with the angels kind of speech at the end, which is very famous. So that's the plot, which is not a very tight plot whatsoever, right? It's very strange to have a main character. You'll find no example of this, not even usually in Shakespeare's plays, where the main character spends most of the play not doing anything, just depressed, unsure what to do, contemplating suicide, right? That's very strange by itself. Also for a play, you probably felt this yourself, like the time element in the play. How long did the play last in real time? Like in the play's time? How long? Do you have any idea?
A couple of months, no.
Maybe a few months.
Maybe a few months?
Yeah.
Just huge pieces of time just pass, right? He goes away to England and suddenly he's back. There's no kind of like, now the film, they filled that in for you a little bit, right? They showed like, I think they showed scenes of like a ship at sea and so on to try to give you, or they showed the death of Guildenstern, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern briefly. This isn't really in the play usually. This is just to help you in a movie version make a little more sense of the time structure of the play. How long does that first part take where he's just hanging around depressed? It's really unclear, right? So the time aspect of the play is very unclear. The plot is quite unclear. But it has a really nice bang of an ending, right? Everybody dies. That's also quite strange for a film. It's not strange for a play. It's not strange for Shakespeare. But it is very, if you look at the history of plays, you'll find nothing like that at the time or before that. If you look to ancient Greek plays, which are the plays that pretty much everyone imitated and knew, and were the main plays, you don't find many medieval plays. There are a few. There are really short Christian moral plays that exist. But aside from that, you have the ancient plays, and then the composition of plays kind of started again in the modern period, right? You had operas, of course, that developed in the meantime in Italy. But again, they were modeled on ancient models and ancient stories. Any of you were in 201?
Yeah, I was.
Did you read Sophocles, the Oedipus the King?
Yes.
Was it like this? Did
You
you
read
see
it in
Oedipus
05
die on stage or go blind on stage, or?
I don't recall.
You don't recall. I can recall for you. Two people, or one person dies in that play, the mother Jocasta, who is Oedipus's mother and his wife, right? As he marries his mother. She hangs herself horribly above their bridal bed, And then Oedipus, seeing this, tears out his own eyes with the pins that held her dress on. He takes them and digs them and rakes them in his own eyes, and the blood
His dad also.
shoots out all over his beard and so on. What, Alia?
His dad also, before he married
His
his
dad
mother.
was killed before the play starts.
Oh, okay.
He killed his father and married his mother. That's the Oedipus story, right? He didn't know it.
Because of the oracle. He was trying to escape of the oracle.
Yeah, exactly. Now, all of that I just described to you is not in the play. Because when it comes to happen in the play, Oedipus and so Jocasta runs off screen or off stage. Oedipus runs off stage. He discovers her dead. He blinds himself. None of that you see. Instead, a person comes out, a herald, as they're called, a messenger comes out, and announces to the audience, Jocasta is dead and Oedipus has blinded himself, and goes into all that detail I gave you, right? Describes in bloody, gory, nasty detail, all of it. But it never happens on stage. And this is true in general. You never find in ancient plays violence depicted on the stage. No one knows why exactly. It might be because, well, as ancients, they were actually quite familiar with blood and guts and gore. People were dying all the time from plagues, and they were all warriors, and so they didn't really need to see it. It wasn't exciting to them, probably, to see it. Also, afterwards, people kind of theorized that maybe it was against their sense of beauty and order and so on, right? Maybe there were some theoretical, aesthetic reasons they didn't depict these kinds of things on the screen, but they didn't. Whereas in Shakespeare, you'll find like whole wars depicted, like the British versus, the battle of this and that, depicted with hundreds of people on the stage, just a mess, right? Or this death scene in Hamlet where everybody dies at the end. Yes, Hassan?
No, I meant so it's not because maybe if there's children or anything, that
No,
wouldn't be.
children didn't attend plays in the ancient world.
But a lot of Shakespeare's plays do end in death. Like a
Yeah,
lot of
they-
them are in death. And
For people living at the time, Shakespeare's plays would have been unlike anything else they had seen. That they were complicated, they were messy. There was a lot of vulgarity in them. If you know Shakespeare's language, he's basically telling fart jokes half the time, in these kinds of plays. There's very low humor throughout them. Things that would have been thought not morally good, so on, right? But also violence and messiness, just complicated, death all the time, people strangling each other. This is one of the things that Hume and Voltaire talk about, right? He says, can you imagine in The Taming of the Shrew, a man chokes his own wife on stage? Can you imagine this? Who wants to see that? And then even to make it more stupid, she yells that she is dead, right? That he has killed her, because she obviously can't be dead and be yelling that she's dead. So it doesn't make any sense. These kinds of things were not generally depicted in ancient or certainly Renaissance. Renaissance plays are very much about beauty and love, and they have beautiful music with them. They're all to make people who are drinking wine and having a good time, who are noble, feel good, and perhaps also excite them in various ways, right? That was the goal, not to give that kind of rush of excitement and thrill and so on. Probably the reason for this in Shakespeare's plays is Shakespeare's plays were written for two audiences. They were written partially for a royal audience, but they were also performed for the poor or the relatively poor. He made money. That was his main. This is one of the things you see again and again in the modern period, is the public suddenly has money. Even if they're very poor, they have some money to spend. And so just as books become something that you can make a living off of producing for the first time, so writing plays and performing them in front of large audiences becomes for the first time possible, right? And then you want to make something different, because those people don't want to see Sophocles' Oedipus the King, right? It's too boring for them. It doesn't have any connection with their lives. They like the low humor and so on. It's very similar to, if any of you know of, Mozart wrote one opera for the common people, right? The Magic Flute. And it's completely unlike any of his other operas. It's full of low humor and complicatedness and kind of little catchy songs and so on that you wouldn't find in his other works. But many people like it much more because it's more appealing, less boring, less formal, so on. Anyways, that's one way to look at Hamlet. But within Hamlet, there's also this constant kind of mystical relationship to the afterlife, this feeling that there's only a very thin barrier between life and what's beyond life, right? Particularly because Hamlet is constantly talking about what it might be like, the to be or not to be speech, right? It's all about what perhaps that other life just on the other side must be like, and whether it's not better and more peaceful than the life that he is living, right? So he feels tortured. He's depressed and tortured. That's not an ancient sentiment either, right? You're not going to find people depressed and tortured in ancient plays or Renaissance plays. Why? No one wants to see that, it would seem, in those periods. They want to see heroes and love and things like this. They're not, for some reason, they're not interested in a tortured human being. And in the period that Hamlet was written, for the most part, people weren't either. But in the Romantic period, starting more than 150 years after Hamlet was written, people started to rediscover Hamlet and other plays by Shakespeare and to see in them their own tortured sense of self, tortured in the modern world, right? As I said, Romanticism focuses on a number of ideas. Among these are kind of the unhappiness, dissatisfaction with the world, a lack of hope, a lack of optimism that science will, bring us to some kind of better place. No longer optimism in the use of reason as well. Maybe, as I said in the beginning, their idea was that maybe these earlier conceptions of reason were too narrow, too abstract, too formal. They didn't capture the reality of human nature. Let me see here, David Casper Friedrich. I wanted to show you some, yeah.
But in the classical period, weren't there plays with characters who had emotional torture, like dilemmas?
Like who?
Between dilemmas, inner dilemmas.
Yes. I mean, obviously there were always conflicts. I mean, Oedipus had a tragic situation, yes? Lots of inner dilemmas. But his character was to face that tragedy heroically, right? He embraced it. He was the greatest man, and then he was the most miserable of all men. And he took it on himself, and he never sulked, right? Oh, woe is me. I'm poor Oedipus. I'm just going to be depressed. Maybe I'll kill myself. No, he would punish himself. So if Oedipus were to kill himself, it would be an act of his will. I will destroy myself because I am so horrible, right? It would never be this kind of malaise, depression that we find and certainly not for 2 hours, right? As we find Hamlet's entire existence is this kind of back and forth. Now, this is just a German romantic painter. So I say kind of this gives you a good idea of the kind of feeling, right? The idea. This is quite an evocative picture, right? It's a nice picture. It gives you this kind of sense of mystery, right? With the haze, but also of like greatness. Like what is beyond maybe there's something beyond nature that is infinite and unknowable, ungraspable, right? But the single man is kind of looking out and contemplating. So the Romanticism is very contemplative, right? Just as Hamlet is contemplative. He just sits around thinking about human existence, right? It doesn't have a sense of direction. It has a sense of openness, uncertainty, adventure into the unknown, right? Similar, you get these kinds of, even like this, has this kind of sense of a murkiness, lack of clarity. Like the Enlightenment period is the period of like order and clarity and science and nothing mystical. Here's another picture, right? This kind of sense of death all around and decay. This is why this is kind of the origin of the Gothic novel in this period. As I said, Frankenstein and there are lots of other Gothic novels with these themes about, think about what Frankenstein is about, right? This kind of mysterious question about life forces and perhaps science, not normal science, not clean, pristine, deductive science, but maybe like something almost like alchemy again could find the secret of life and create life out of dead material, right? I don't know, it's very, very nice. This is just a good example, I think. You're starting to get the feeling of the romantic, right? It's not about romance. There are very few love stories in this period in that sense. Notice also, as you can expect, religion becomes more central here. The Enlightenment tended to undermine the importance of religion because it tried to reduce religion to something rational. Something, parts of, like Kant, for instance, wrote a book called Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason, in which he went through biblical doctrines and rejected a lot of them because they were not rational, and then accepted others because they were rational and so were true. Here is a sense of the return of religion as the importance of the perhaps irrational or the super rational, right? The too complex to be rational, to be fully made sense of and made clear. And you get that sense in these kinds of the decay, the broken church here in the picture, and the kind of Halloween-esque feeling to a lot of these paintings. Okay, so this is what Schlegel is going to be thinking about. Now, here's another one. They're not always depressing, right? Sometimes they just have these peculiar, they're very interested also in like crystals and things like this. Homeopathy, a lot of them were interested in, people who were even philosophers, interested in perhaps the secret powers of certain chemicals and things. You can see how there's this kind of return to searching for some kind of secret key to happiness, to health, which is clearly a kind of rejection of the idea that science is going to figure this all out for us, right? Just as homeopathy is a kind of rejection of traditional medicine, and this kind of looking for, you know what homeopathy is, right? Kind of non-traditional medicine, use of herbs and things like this. Anyways, so if we go to the text, here's David Hume in his dapper hat. David Hume, I said, is a philosopher of the modern period. He was influenced by Locke. He's typical Enlightenment, Scottish Enlightenment figure. And Voltaire, I'm sure many of you have heard of Voltaire, very similar, very famous French critic of the Enlightenment, all about reason and order and good taste. That's how you should think of Voltaire. Now, how did they think of Shakespeare? Anyone want to tell me how they felt about Shakespeare? First of all, Hume. So Hala?
They found him
Yeah, they found him very vulgar and of poor taste, and like whatever like moments of like interesting stuff that happened in his plays, they said it was just like a coincidence, and but like overall they didn't find it like up to their standards.
Yeah, they couldn't be more negative, right? They really go out of their way. And I put this here because it should be surprising to you. Today, like everybody fawningly, oh, Shakespeare, he's a genius, obviously. His plays are fantastic. And you read them, I'm sure, and you watch the film and you're like, I don't quite get it. Is it really as fantastic as they say? I guess it is. I'll read it and read it and read it until I see the genius. That is actually their point of view. In fact, they think those who do like him do so for not very good reasons. And it should surprise us. Hume, great writer, very intelligent, up to date on everything. Voltaire, the same. Great critics, philosophers of their age. And their ideas here are not exceptional. This is what was the common view. That's why I put in the text both of them. And you see how very similar they are. Although Hume never read what Voltaire wrote, and Voltaire never read what Hume wrote on Shakespeare, they come up with almost exactly the same characterization. And it's horribly negative. Right? You would find no one writing this way about Shakespeare. And this shows that the great image of Shakespeare that you and I have is the image of Shakespeare that was produced in the Romantic period. Shakespeare, as we know him, is not a product of the 1600s. He's a product of the late 18th century and early 19th century. So this kind of fawning praise of Shakespeare as a genius of human nature and the greatest poet ever and so on and so forth. That is a much, much later invention, because at that time, this is how everything works, right? If you're out of step with your time, the people of your time don't read you. They think you're an idiot, right? You could, if you were living in ancient times and you came up with a theory that the sun was the center of the universe or of the solar system, they just laugh at you. But if you come up with the idea at the right time, suddenly what you are saying speaks to the changes that are going on in history and the needs of intellectuals at the time, and suddenly you become the most important character, right? And so Shakespeare becomes this example of the Romantic. Now, let's look exactly at what they say. That was a good summary, but interestingly, back in when Hume was writing Rude, you know, you have this word rude, you're a rude person, means you're not very friendly. That didn't mean that when this was written. Rude means uncultivated, crude, savage. Probably a better way is just to say, put a C in front of there, crude, right? It doesn't mean rude. So this is a very backhanded praise here at the beginning. It says, if Shakespeare be considered as a man, like if you're willing to consider Shakespeare a man, born in a crude age, educated in the worst, lowest manner, without any instruction, either from the world or from books, right? Completely ignorant fellow. If we consider him that, he may be regarded as a prodigy, right? If he were considered that, then it would be amazing what he has come up with. Of course, he wasn't educated in a rude age. He wasn't with no education in the lowest manner or any instruction. He had that. And so accordingly, we shouldn't regard him as a prodigy, right? So that's how this is a backhanded comment, saying, if we consider Alia a person of absolutely no talents, raised by wolves, then her essay is very good, right? That's how that would be. But otherwise, it seems like it's from someone of no talent who was raised by wolves. If represented as a poet capable of furnishing proper entertainment, right, to a refined and intelligent audience, we must abate this eulogy. We must not say that he is so great, right? If we consider him as someone who's trying to speak to an intelligent audience. in his compositions, we regret that many irregularities and underlining, right? You get the sense really quickly if you start to do this, right? Underline the words used. It's gonna catch up with me any moment. Rude. Irregularities. Oops. Absurdities.
Didn't they also say that he didn't like respect some sort of rules that a play should
Yeah.
have?
Obviously, irregular means without rule, right? Absurdities, that so frequently disfigure, like a monster. Animated, so this is a positive, somewhat positive quality. Passionate, right? But at the same time, we admire more the beauties on account of their being surrounded by such, again, deformities. Lack of form, lack of rule, irregular, absurd, but passionate and animated, wild is another word they'll use, right? Striking, peculiar. Peculiar means unusual, strange, right? Just like something that's deformed. Of sentiment, a feeling, again, passion, feeling. Adapted to a singular character, meaning, again, strange or weird. Frequently hits by mere inspiration, spirit, animated, passionate, right? But a reasonable propriety of thought he cannot. You could also go through and highlight the opposites, right? What are the opposites? Proper, refined, intelligent, reasonable, right? He's not reasonable. He doesn't, reasonable propriety he does not have. Nervous. You can see he's characterizing Shakespeare as a whole just as you might characterize Hamlet. He doesn't do what he's supposed to. He's doesn't follow the rules. He's absurd, right? He wants to kill himself. He is passionate and animated, but he is peculiar and nervous, right? Picturesque. We'll see picturesque is important for Schlegel. But in vain we look either for purity, he lacks purity, so he is impure. He lacks simplicity. These are the positive qualities that he lacks. So he's complicated, he's overcomplicated. He is ignorant, ignorant of all total ignorance of all theoretical art and conduct. Right? He doesn't know how you actually do a play. In other words, he doesn't know the rules. How do you do it? How do you put it together? How it should be formed? He's totally ignorant. Yet, as it affects the spectator rather than the reader, we can more easily excuse than that want of taste. So he has no taste. He lacks taste. Often prevails in his productions and which gives way only by intervals to the irradiations of genius. Now, interestingly here, genius is not a positive, it is in a sense a positive idea, but on the whole it's not. Because the notion of genius won't become a kind of unquestionably positive characteristic until the Romantic period, really. Even after, almost, not even before the 1790s, will it become something. Today, if you're called a genius, no one says, well, oh, that's unfortunate. He's a genius. But Hume is here saying, unfortunately, Shakespeare was only a genius. Because the word genius doesn't quite mean the same. Originally, does anyone know the origin of the word genius? Etymologically, even?
I'm thinking genes.
Well, think of another gene word.
Genome.
Think less scientific.
Okay. I don't know.
Genie.
Genie. Yes. I dream of genie. A genie, a spirit, right? The idea of a genius, of someone who has like a spirit, what Socrates referred to as a demon, a daimon in Greek, a spirit that inspires them, right? Inspiration, genius is inspired, has spirit poured into them from a spirit. Let me let Abdullah back in. So that's the idea of genius. Now, that spirit can be good or bad. It means that it's similar here, right? It's these animated. Why are we alive? Because we have a soul, a spirit. Our productions are genius when they're full of spirit, animation, passion. But here, that's associated with wildness, irregularity, not following the rule. So genius is a good quality in a certain respect because it's living and active. But here it's almost exclusively otherwise negative because it's put up to his lack of training, lack of understanding, his lack of rule governedness, his lack of taste. It's wild and so on. A great and fertile, right? Genius produces fertile genius. He's certainly possessed, right? But he ought be cited as a proof of how dangerous it is to rely on these advantages alone, right? It's like saying a wild man, yeah, he's very strong. But to properly box, you have to know the rules. You have to be trained. Otherwise, you lose, right? It's marvelous that you're so strong, but you'll lose to all the real fighters because they are strong, but they also have training and skill and knowledge and so on. There's a very, very good parallel there with the way he's thinking of genius, like brute strength of mind. So how dangerous it is to rely on these advantages alone for attaining an excellence in the finer arts, right? And there may even remain a suspicion that we overrate, if possible, the greatness of his genius. So even his genius, we probably overrate that. Why? Because kind of the wildness of it we're unused to and might impress us more than it really should, right? You know people like this, even in the modern world where we talk about genius, who are just a bit crazy. And you wonder if it's maybe their craziness that impresses us more than their art, right? Andy Warhol, an example of a modern artist. He's dead, he's been dead for quite a while, but nevertheless, he has a crazy personality, very bold, and that you wonder, maybe that's why people buy up and pay millions of dollars for pictures of Marilyn Monroe that he never touched, right? They were produced in his factory. Because of the boldness of his character. It's similar what he's saying here. Shakespeare, maybe we overrate him even as a genius because he's so violent and so bold and so chaotic, right? He says this, in the same manner as bodies often appear more gigantic on account of their being disproportioned and misshapen, right? So all those things I talked about earlier about how Hamlet the time is strange in it. It doesn't have a clear direction. You don't know what's going to happen. The plot is very murky. And it's very many different plots going on. Ancient plays never had more than one plot, right? But Hamlet has all these subplots. They didn't like subplots. Subplots would just ruin the play, according to someone like Hume. All those things are what Hume would look at and read Hamlet and say, what a terrible play. What a mess of a play. Then he compares Shakespeare to a contemporary named Jonson. And I just put this here because here Jonson has all those qualities that Shakespeare lacked, but lacks any genius whatsoever. Right? This is how Hume criticizes Jonson. So Jonson has learning, right? He has the knowledge and the rules, but he has no genius whatsoever. Both of them are deficient in taste and elegance, in harmony and correctness. So this is a good example of what Hume thinks is the positive. This is a play to be good should have taste, elegance, harmony, and correctness. Why? Because Johnson just copied things and didn't have any real spirit of his own. Okay. So that's Hume's characterization. So far, what do you think? Is he right? This is how you found Hamlet? You said, what a terrible play.
Yeah, I mean, I always did find Shakespeare to be a bit overrated. Not gonna lie.
Of course, that's not what I'm teaching you.
Yeah.
When we read Schlegel, you should perhaps become reconvinced of the greatness of him. But it's important here to see that the greatness of a piece of literature really depends upon the point of view from which you're reading it, what you're looking for in it. And what Shakespeare was aiming for was not what the Romantics found in it. He wasn't intentionally making a play that broke the rules, and he was trying to satisfy an audience that was not an educated audience. So in this way, he had to satisfy common people, and it so happens that the Romantics, what the common people want, were what the Romantics suddenly became their ideal. Right? What happens strangely in the Romantic period is, in the previous periods, the ideal of the educated was some kind of high theoretical ideal play, whereas in the Romantics, the intellectuals start to look to common people and the standards of common life as like, that's where the real mystery is. That's what we're interested in suddenly. And because Shakespeare depicts real life in all of its messiness, that maybe make for a bad play, but it makes for a fascinating one with real human characters with complexities and passions that don't make sense, that the Romantics were looking for. And so you see this really like the Shakespeare gets revived in kind of the ultimate level, or the end result of that whole idea of the modern period of the proper study of mankind as man, right? But initially when that was found in Alexander Pope and others, their belief is that that man will be this kind of ordered system, just like the planets, and that science will reveal the complexities of man are really this nice ordered system of passions and reason and so on, working together in harmony. Whereas in the Romanticism, they've lost that. They no longer believe in that. They believe human nature is this chaos of mysterious passions and desires and so on, right? And so that's what they look to be depicted in. So it's still the study of man, but now we need to look to real man to understand him. And Shakespeare depicts real men, right, in real life. And this is how one reason he comes to be so important for them. Now, Voltaire. Here we all are with Voltaire. We can go through this very quickly. So he talks about the theater of and similar when he lived. Again, his genius refers to Shakespeare's genius, strong and fertile, just as Hume did, full of nature and the sublime. Now, the sublime, we've all heard of the beautiful, yes? What is the sublime?
Is it like
Maybe
extraordinarily beautiful or something like that? It's like an exaggerated way of saying beautiful.
It's
No.
something wonderful, like mystical, like almost magical.
Yeah, so there
Inspires a certain awe.
exactly. Beauty, the examples of beauty that you would give is like a flower, a rainbow, a person, so on and so forth, right? In this period, they would think of the feminine as beautiful, right? It's very sexist. Men can be beautiful. They shouldn't be beautiful. They should be sublime, right? Sublimity is associated with power and awe, impressive. Looking out, I can look out my window here and see the sea, right, in front of AUB campus. It's awe-inspiring, it's sublime. The starry skies, the infinite universe, that is the feeling of the sublime. right? The greatness of God. Angels are beautiful. God is sublime, right? One is pleasing and the other can be terrifying. Mountains and rocks. Now, what do you think is more associated with Romanticism? Although Voltaire is living way before Romanticism. Yeah?
Beauty.
Let's think
Could
about
you
it.
please repeat the question?
Which, the beautiful or the sublime, do you think are more associated
The
with
sublime.
Romanticism? Yeah, absolutely the sublime. That's what's going on here, right? Power, the sharpness, the kind of, there's something just sublime about the shapes of these rocks, or this ice was probably what it is.
Especially during the Romantic period, people started feeling awe towards nature, and they started diminishing the role of humans
Yeah.
in like when they represent humans, they look very small compared to nature, and nature looks huge, and it is the source of the sublime.
This painting here is perfect example, yeah? The sublime. All of these, in fact. Even this is sublime, right? Something terrifying about it. Why? Because it brings to mind death, which is this enormous thing, right? This mystical thing that we're in awe of. Life and death, God, religion, these are sublime topics. So just as religion has a kind of comeback, but not as like a dainty, orderly religion that is rational, but as a religion that is mystical. Just as that comes back, that's because that's a sublime sense of religion, right? That comes with the idea of sublimity itself. What breaks the bounds of order? So, not surprisingly, looking back at the text, although Voltaire the Romanticism was far away when this was written, still, he interestingly associates Shakespeare with the sublime, right? Like he's already anticipated with nature and the sublime. But for him, that's not positive, right? Because as he goes on, without the slightest spark of good taste, right? Without the least understanding of the rules. To us, this sounds terrible. Like Voltaire is a school teacher. Oh, Shakespeare, you get a D. It was quite good in some ways. Overall, it was terrible. I will tell you something daring but true. The great accomplishments of this author doomed the English theater. He gave us such beautiful scenes, such great and terrible moments, great and terrible, sprinkled through his monstrous farces, right? Monstrous again, disordered, irregular, exactly the same thing we found in Hume. Some call these tragedies, that these plays always have performed to great applause. Time, which alone can establish man's reputation, has at last made those defects respectable. Now this is some backhanded compliments again, just like Hume, saying, yeah, some people like him, the common people like Shakespeare. And over time, because it's been over 100 years, 150, well, nearly, yes, about 150 years since Shakespeare. He's saying, well, time has made us no longer be able to see how terrible Shakespeare is, right? It's covered over and made his defects respectable. Bizarre and monstrous inventions, right, of this author have, after 200 years, gained the right to be considered sublime, again, sublime. Most modern authors have copied them, but what worked well for Shakespeare is hissed at when they try it. And you can imagine that the homage paid to this older writer grows in proportion to the disrespect given to modern playwrights. No one understands that one ought not to imitate him, and the failures of these imitators simply makes others believe he is inimitable. So his plays were actually terrible, is what Voltaire is saying. They didn't follow the rules, but people start, because of his popularity, people try to imitate him. But when they imitate him, of course, their works are just as bad as his work. But theirs aren't old, and they're only copies of his. And so they get hissed off stage, and they don't understand why. And people say, well, that's because Shakespeare was such a sublime genius. He was so much better, he was so great, that you cannot imitate him. He's inimitable, right? And so they turn it's actually because Shakespeare was so bad, and you try to imitate him, and you're bad, that tricks people into thinking that Shakespeare was so good, he can't be imitated, right? There's a funny, nice little piece of argument there. Here he goes into detail. He says, you know that in the Moor of Venice, a very touching play, a husband strangles his wife on the stage, and when the poor woman is strangled, she cries that she has been unjustly killed. You are aware that in Hamlet, the gravediggers are drunk, sing tavern songs, and make jokes proper to their profession, their low profession, as they play with the skulls they unearth. But what will surprise you is that these follies were imitated. These are follies, right? They were imitated during the reign of Charles II, an era of elegance and a golden age of the fine arts, right? So the only thing that's more astounding than the kind of absurdities we find in Shakespeare's plays is that that people tried to imitate them. That's well, actually, there's something at the very end here I'll talk about. When you saw that in Hamlet, this is where Hamlet comes back from England and he runs into the gravediggers, and he finds Horatio's skull and holds it up and says, you know, where these lips once hung, poor Horatio. He talks to the skull about the fleetingness of life. That's often quoted as one of the most sublime moments in theater, right? It's been imitated how many times as a great moment of theater, right? The speech when he's speaking to the skull of Horatio. Did that occur when you watched that? What did you think?
I don't like skulls personally.
I thought he was insane, honestly.
What?
I thought he was going insane.
You thought he was going insane. Didn't you find it a very profound moment in the play? That's how most people find it, right? He's contemplating the skull of a friend, right? He finds it, and he cannot believe that just so many years ago he remembers that he rode on this guy's back and played with him. And now this is what human life is, right? Seems like a depressing, sublime, profound contemplation. He's looking at his own mortality in looking at the skull of his friend, right? That's the romantic reading of it. What does Voltaire say? Can you believe he's playing with a skull? Right? And they're telling jokes and singing songs. You don't do that. You don't do that with a body, right? Body is a sacred thing that should be buried and da-da-da. You don't just carry it around and play with it and make fun of it. It's just an absurdity. A moment that should never be in a play, right? So you can see how different the take on that is. So here is a fine picture of August Wilhelm Schlegel. I'll say a word or two about him. Schlegel was one of a pair of brothers. Friedrich Schlegel was his brother. They're both extremely famous. You probably never heard of them. But they were the kind of central figures of German Romanticism. Friedrich Schlegel was the kind of philosopher of German Romanticism, the theoretician. He wrote, they co-founded a journal called the Athenaeum, which was extremely influential and without which most of what we know about Romanticism would have never happened. We are romantics in a way. All of you use the terms genius and the sublime and your sensibilities about art and creativity and things were all the product of the Romantic period and of people like the two Schlegel brothers. They founded a small group, including the wife of another philosopher that then Friedrich Schlegel had an affair with and married. And they all wrote in this journal together, along with this other German philosopher named Schelling. And they were kind of the intellectual center of German Romanticism. And then out of that, you had like also the literary figures of German Romanticism, which were like, some of you have seen The Nutcracker. E.T.A. Hoffmann, the author of The Nutcracker, and a number of other really strange stories. Those are German Romanticism. The story of the Sandman, some of you have probably heard of it. Go read it over the summer. It's my task for some of you. Of your remaining, read a short story called The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffmann. It is very strange. But they're kind of horrific. They're kind of like gothic in the way that like Frankenstein and so on. They're frightening, but they also have all these themes of the sublime and the terrible and the monstrous. The monstrous suddenly becomes positive in Romanticism. Whereas we've seen throughout this course the monstrous as negative. From Copernicus forward, remember? Comparing Ptolemy's model to a monster. Now suddenly in the Romantic period, monsters become something to think about because they might teach us about the secret capacities of nature that we had never thought about. They're irregular, deformed, but maybe that's the way life really is, right? Maybe they reveal something science doesn't. August Schlegel, by contrast with his brother, was an art historian. So he wrote a lot of books on the theory of art and the history of art. And this is particularly, his lectures were very influential on criticism. So the idea of criticism now becomes one of the central ideas of Romanticism, which is if science, now why is that? And he talks about that a little bit in this book. If science is no longer the proper approach to understanding man and nature, then the question is, what is the proper approach, right? It's going to be something less, something more in touch, they believe, with reality, with actuality of the world. And there are various answers to this question. Hegel, a very famous philosopher living at the time, Hegel, thought that he could kind of save the Enlightenment idea of science by finding a new idea of science and a new idea of religion that would go beyond the old one of the Enlightenment. And so he could kind of remain in the project of the Enlightenment and of reason, but he would fix it and broaden it so that it kind of satisfied what people were looking for at the time. Others thought that poetry would replace science. Because poetry was the way we could explore, poetry and art were the true ways of exploring human nature. Because human nature could only be studied as in the process of its productions, in its own creativity, in its reality, in its life. To step back and to theoretically consider it was to kill it, right? You could only study something scientifically if it was already dead, in a certain sense, like the anatomist studies the human body. But if you really want to understand human life, you should study a living human being. And in fact, if you really want to understand a human life, you should be human and live, right? This is the kind of ideas they had. And so it meant art, literature, poetry were the ways of accessing these other dimensions of human nature. Maybe religion as well. But a new kind of religion, not the old kind of religion. Schlegel, however, this is the third path. So not directly by being a poet, by being an artist, and not by some other way, but by contemplating art and thinking about art in all of its complexity. This is the way that Schlegel offers. And this is what he calls criticism. To be a critic is to be a person who has developed themselves through study of history and of art in history to a point where they can properly understand for the first time those productions in an authentic way and understand through art and nature and literature and poetry, through the criticism of it, understand human nature better and the world and all things. So it's related to those who thought that poetry and art are the path. But his idea is that it's not actually those things. It's the contemplation of them, the comprehension of them. And that's what this whole book is about. It wants to, basically the idea is theory in the past, science in the past was too abstract, too unrelated to reality, to life. How do you fix that problem? By adding to it a deep absorption in history itself. A theory that is essentially tied to history. And that's what criticism is. It's theorizing, but theorizing always about actual pieces of literature and art, right? So in these lectures, what he does, in the first lecture, he's going to talk about what he does and about the theory of criticism itself, right? Essentially, his goal is to combine the theory of art with its history. That's what criticism does. But that's not simple to do, right? How do you, if you look at the theory of art, it's what Voltaire referred to. It's the rules, as he'll talk about in Aristotle. Various rules that people have come up with. That's the theory. You can't really integrate that with history. The problem is that theory is too abstract. What you need is to get the theory, generate the theory out of the study of the history. So it's not like you have the theory already and you have the history and the critic just brings them together. But the critic has to discover the rules in the actual works. Look to those for the rules. Study Shakespeare to find out what the rules are, right? And some of those rules might be that there are no rules, right? That might be part of the comprehension of what we get. So it belongs to the general philosophy of poetry and the other fine arts to establish the fundamental laws of the beautiful. So every art, on the other hand, has its special theory designed to teach the limits, the difficulties, and the means by which it must be regulated in its attempt to realize those laws. For this purpose, certain scientific investigations are indispensable to the artist, although they have but little attraction for those whose admiration of art is confined to the enjoyment of the actual productions. The general theory, on the other hand, seeks to analyze the essential faculty of human nature. Right? So the theory of art has its object the essential capacities of human nature itself. So art is not just art. It's a way of studying human nature itself, right? The sense of the beautiful, which once calls the fine arts into existence and accounts for the satisfaction which arises them, also points out the relation that subsists between this and all other sentient and cognizing faculties of man. So it shows how beauty, its source in human nature, the sense of the beautiful and the sublime, and how this relates to our other mental abilities and the mind as a whole. To the man of thought and speculation, therefore, it is of the highest importance, the theory of art, because it allows us to understand man. And by itself alone, it is quite inadequate to guide and direct the essays and practices of the arts. Now, the history of the fine arts informs us what has been, and theory teaches what ought to be accomplished by them. A key point, but without some intermediate and connecting link. Remember I said, it's the link between theory and history that criticism is all about. Both would remain independent and separate from one another, and each by itself inadequate and defective. So life without theory, practice of art without theory remains inadequate and defective, but theory without history and knowledge of the real remains inadequate and defective, right? This connecting link is furnished by criticism, which both elucidates the history of the arts and makes the theory fruitful. So theory by itself is abstract, stale, and without fruit. And history by itself is useless, but the two together, that's what criticism tries to achieve, right? So how does criticism operate? Interestingly, to be a critic, one has to develop a kind of their own mind to be able to appreciate art throughout history in its own historical context. This is a new ideal of the Romantic period. Remember, let me relate this to, we've seen again and again in the figures of the Enlightenment that we've read, that the way to understand the truth is to abstract from all peculiarities of history and tradition, right? To get rid of those. Don't look at history. Don't look at what other people said, right? If you want the truth, follow the method that I give you. What does the method require? It requires you to not follow anything that comes from your own language, your own culture, your own history, your own character, your own desires. No, get rid of all those things, and for the first time, you will have truth, right? And anyone who follows their prejudices, if we look back to Aristotle, what do we see? We see a man of his time who should not have been a man of his time, but if he had the truth, would have followed a method that is timeless, right? That was what we've seen again and again. Negative for the Enlightenment was culture, heritage, language. These are negative things because they block the way to the truth. In Romanticism, the idea now, you can expect from what we've said, is that, as we believe today, a lot of people, is that the way to the truth is through history, not by getting rid of our heritage and our prejudices, but by understanding our heritage and our prejudices, right? And understanding those of other people. So the way to see the truth for Schlegel is not to ignore all of history, but to deeply immerse oneself in all of history. And one becomes universal and unprejudiced by knowing more about the world instead of knowing less about the world. See, there's a kind of this different idea. Don't suppress difference of others and ignore it, understand it. And in the second way, you don't become more prejudiced, you become less prejudiced by comprehending prejudices, understanding the history and their influence on things. So we see this notion of a new enlightened way of thinking, which isn't opposed to tradition, but embraces tradition and history. In this passage, it says, but no man can be a true critic or connoisseur without universality of mind. You could see this in any one of the we've read. You want universality of mind, right? You want to think the truth in the way that everyone else would think it. But see how he follows that up. So universality of mind. Without that flexibility, so no man can be a critic without universality of mind. Without that flexibility, which enables him by renouncing all personal predilections, all personal prejudices. That still sounds like Descartes and others, right? And blind habits to adapt himself to the peculiarities of other ages and nations, right? So up until this part of the sentence, it sounds Descartes, whatever, get rid of your own prejudices, right? But he's saying, get rid of your own prejudices so you can understand and he doesn't call them prejudices, he calls them the peculiarities, the characteristics of other ages and nations, right? Those are of no interest to Descartes. Those are of no interest to Bacon. They want truth, technology, the future, progress. He's saying, no, we need to understand human nature, but the only way to understand human nature in all of its weirdness and complexity is to break out of our own personal prejudices and predilections so that we can understand the predilections and prejudices of others. To feel them, as it were, from their proper central point, that is feeling. To understand Aristotle, you have to try to get into Aristotle's mind. That's what he's saying, right? To understand an artist of the medieval period, you have to understand what it is to be and to live as a medieval person. To understand what it is to be a modern person, you have to understand what the modern world is like and feel what it's like. Otherwise, their art and productions is nothing to you. You can't comprehend them because they were animated by that feeling for what life is like. So to feel them, as it were, from their proper central point and what ennobles human nature, to recognize and duly appreciate whatever is beautiful and grand under the external accessories which were necessary to its embodying. Saying here, you cannot understand what is and appreciate art and literature of the past or of any time without understanding the circumstances, the external circumstances which were necessary to its being created, right? Even though occasionally they may seem to disguise and distort it. And now notice, this is very non-enlightenment, right? Descartes and Bacon and others would say, anybody in history could have discovered the truth, but we are the first. I am the first, right? Anyone could have followed my method, but I am the first to discover it. Now notice what Schlegel says. There is no monopoly of poetry for particular ages and nations. No age, no nation, no the English versus the North American Indians. If the North American Indians have poetry or some form of song or whatever, the European is no better than theirs. No one has a monopoly on goodness when it comes to productions and art. There is no monopoly for poetry for particular ages and nations. And consequently, that despotism of taste. Notice, you see this in Voltaire and others, despotism of taste. What's proper? They would look at Chinese literature, for instance, or Chinese theater and say, how barbaric, right? That should be like ours. Ours is right. Ours follows the true rules. This is what Schlegel is saying, no. This is against the true spirit of criticism, right? It's a despotism of taste, which would seek to invest with universal authority the rules which at first perhaps were but arbitrarily advanced, is but a vain and empty pretension, right? This somewhat sounds like Bruno to us, right? Unlike other people in the period, this idea of universality and broadness of mind being associated with valuing others as they truly are and as their own being themselves expressions. So just as Bruno would say, all peoples on every being on every planet and every worm and whatever is close to God, an expression of God's creativity. So here Schlegel would say, every piece of poem by every tribe or people in the world and every age is an expression of human nature in its circumstances and deserves to be valued and studied. Poetry, taken in its widest acceptation as the power of creating what is beautiful and representing it to the eye and ear, is a universal gift of heaven, shared to an external extent even by those whom we call by barbarians and savages. Internal excellence, right? Now, he's not saying all art and poetry is the same. If you make up some crappy poem, he's not saying, well, this is as good as everything else. He wants to accept that there are better forms and worse forms. But the measure of what is a better form of poetry is whether it better expresses the life that it originates from. So that makes it possible for there to be just as great of a Chinese language poem of the Ming Dynasty as a poem of the ancient Greeks, if they express their own form of life well. And some of them may not, and so are not good pieces of poetry relative to their own time. That's why he talks about internal excellence. So he's not saying everything is equal. He's saying all forms of human life, all peoples are capable of expressing something about human nature that in that respect is equal. But there are better and worse expressions relative to those times. And where this exists, we must not allow ourselves to be repelled by the external appearance. So even if you see a Shakespeare play and you are repelled by because it doesn't fit your own sensibilities, right? You should try to look beyond those to understand it in its own terms. Everything must be traced to the root of human nature. If it has sprung from thence, it has undoubted worth of its own, but without possessing a living germ, it is merely externally attached thereto. This is what I just said. It will never thrive nor acquire a proper growth. So he says bad poetry, bad literature, he gives a nice image of it here. He says it's like a child's garden. It's not living. What is a child's garden? Did anyone read this? And this is the last thing we'll talk about. I will post a video maybe with some wrap up of this, but what is this image, the last thing here, what is this image of a child's garden that he talks about?
Like, I understood, like, for example, if a child brings a flower and plants it, but without taking care, like if the roots are planted properly and maybe it's just cut, you know, not without the roots. So you'd look at it on the outside and look, oh, how beautiful the flower is. But soon enough it dies because, you know, it's not planted.
So many of you have probably seen children do this, or it makes sense, right? They go pick flowers. They tear flowers off, and then they go and find dirt, and they put the flowers in the dirt in a nice arrangement, and it looks pretty or whatever, it looks cute. And then within 2 hours, the flowers are all bent over and dead, right? So this is kind of like, this is the model of bad literature and poetry. It's not that they don't fit the rules, it's that they're not living. They don't grow from the soil they're planted in. They don't reflect their own time and the lives of real people. They're artificial, right? Their rules are artificial. And that is so Shakespeare, by contrast, he's some exotic flower growing from some very strange soil. And so he gives a very good example of this of the right, what makes poetry and literature good. And what makes it good for one time might be exactly what makes it seem strange and disliked by another people, right? It expresses better the Greek way of life than it doesn't express the modern way of life, right? And maybe the things that we valued in Greek poetry was because they were like us. But that was wrong, right? Maybe the very things that in the past were appreciated by Europeans shouldn't have been appreciated, and the things that weren't appreciated should have been appreciated, right? We shouldn't make everything after our own image. We should look for what is most bizarre and strange, and that might be where we learn the most about human nature. So you should all go read the stories of the Grimm brothers during this period. They were romantic. Some of you heard of the Grimm brothers? You know,
yeah, the fables. I don't know how to say
all
in
the
English.
stories that we all know from Disney. Disney is a wonderful example of what Schlegel would say is bad. Because they took the Grimm brothers stories. The Grimm brothers were romantics as well, and they went out and collected folk stories of the Germans, like Cinderella, right? And so on. And those stories, if you read the original versions, are really strange. People die, get tortured, get eaten. And what did Disney do? They took out all the strange things and made them acceptable to children, right? For someone like Schlegel and for the Grimm brothers, they took exactly what those stories could have taught us about human nature, cut it out, what reflected their own time, cut it out, and replaced it with what pleases us modern people. Okay, I hope you all enjoyed this course. Thank you for the extra few minutes here. As I said, I will post another video.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes?
Sir, till what date we have to finish the annotations, the new annotations?
So I said the annotation should cover all of Schlegel, and I mean, I'll probably look at them again after, when you take the final. That's probably when I'll look at them again. So you can pretty much make sure you have all your annotations finished and whatnot by the 22nd.
It's until 485, right?
485 or 470 for the annotations?
485 in total. Okay, and that is I will post something about that, but I can ask you about any of that material in the final as well. So keep that in mind. Do read the rest of it. I mean, most of what I've said will just get brought together more closely with Shakespeare and Hamlet in those last pages. So it's very good to read. Any questions, other questions, comments?
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. I've enjoyed having each of you in here, and thank you for participating. And
Sir, I have a question. Can you please send us what is the material included for the final and how will the final be, and more details about the final exam?
I mean, I can send an email, but I'm not going to say much more than what I've said. Everything that I have assigned is material for the final. I will ask you 2 or 3 questions. You have 15 minutes. Those questions can be anything I think about. I will follow them up probably a little bit, and we'll have a conversation. That's what the final will be. But I can put that in an email if you want. Okay?
Okay, Professor. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Have a good weekend.
You too. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.